Okay, that's nice and loud. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm going to start my talk off with a little story, one that many of you probably know something about already. So imagine 70,000 years ago, there's a small group of modern humans, Africans, and they're standing at the gates of Eurasia in the Sinai, the place that we call Sinai today. And today, of course, it's a desert, but back then it was a grassland. To their left is the Mediterranean, to their right are the Sinai Mountains, and in front of them, all of Eurasia. But it's filled with near-modern humans, Neanderthals, right there at those gates. Yet, they leave Africa, and in a short period, inhabit the entire world, all those other species go extinct. Now, how did they do that? How did they win against other hominids that had been evolved for those specific habitats? And what I'm going to do in my talk is I'm going to build a hypothesis for how and why that happened. So the whole talk is going to work on that hypothesis and then end with a general model of the series of additions to what you might think of as the human uniqueness complex, those things that are unique about our species that made us this most invasive species. So what I'm going to do first, though, is I'm going to give you the background to the biological story. And I started this slide 10 years ago, and it changes every couple of months. And if you follow the science news, just 2 weeks ago, there were 3 major genetics papers in Nature on modern human origins genetics. And I've had to tweak it, just in time for this talk. So on the bottom, I have a proxy record for world temperature. This is the Epoca ice core, the Delta Deuterium record. And when that line is down here in the blue, the world is in a glacial phase, okay? And when that line is up here in the red, it's in an interglacial phase. And of course, we're in an interglacial phase right now. And if you could resolve this, you'd actually be up quite a bit. And the take-home message that I want you to get from that graph is that the latter part of human origins is mostly spent during a glacial phase. Okay, so the world looked very, very different than what it looks like today. So this is why, in my field, we spend a lot of time and money trying to figure out the paleoclimatic and paleoenvironmental context. And then above, I've really simplified the human origin story, and I've broken it into 2 lineages, the Eurasian lineage and the African lineage. And when the lines end in circles, that means it ends in extinction. But I'm going to build on this over the next couple of minutes. Now, we know from the genetic and the fossil record that these 2 lineages share a common ancestor sometime around 700,000 years ago. And from 700,000 years ago to about 400,000 years ago, there's gene flow between those lineages. And that gene flow keeps those lineages from diverging significantly. Okay, so we're not seeing a major divergence event at this time. And then, right around 400,000 years ago, that gene flow is cut. And we don't really know why it's cut, but I think what happened at that point is, as you can see, the climate record becomes highly variable at this point, and I think the Sahara Desert probably formed right at that point, and the Sahara and its extension into the Arabian Peninsula acts as a cork on the bottom of Africa, and people can't get in and out on a regular basis. So that's when we start to see these lineages diverge into wildly different directions. And we know from the genetic record, we actually have very, very little fossil material, that lineage over in Eastern Asia branches off, the Denisovan lineage, and we don't know a lot about this lineage. And of course, the Neanderthal lineage branches off as well, and we know a lot about Neanderthals. We have almost almost 200 individuals represented in the fossil record, some by nearly complete skeletons. And then from both the genetic record and the fossil record, we know that the modern human lineage, the lineage that leads to everybody alive on the planet today, appears probably somewhere around 200 to 150,000 years ago. We're going to get that date tighter and tighter and tighter over time. And then right around 70,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, a small founder population, that founder population I was pointing to, those modern humans, those Africans who leave Africa into Eurasia, and they give rise to all Eurasians. So at that point, we have these two main lineages, Eurasians and Africans. And then something very interesting happens. The founder population of Eurasians interbreeds with Neanderthals. And some of that Neanderthal DNA crosses over into the Eurasian genome, what we call introgression, and is now present at a level of 2 to 3% in all Eurasians today. So we have a snippet of those Neanderthals inside us. And then we see this incredible thing happen. There's this massive radiation out of the modern human lineage of all the ethno-linguistic groups that you see on the planet today. Thousands of new languages, and we now know from the genetic record that those ethno-linguistic groups are essentially closed breeding populations. We can recognize ethno-linguistic groups by their genetics, radiating all over the place. And something very interesting happens. The lineage that leads to Melanesians and Aborigines and crosses over into Australia and Papua New Guinea interbreeds with Denisovans such that they have snippets of Denisovan DNA in their genome. And then the same thing happens in Africa. Modern human Africans interbreed with some archaic lineage hanging around after the Out of Africa movement. So the story there is even though we don't have Denisovans and Neanderthals around, we have bits and pieces preserved inside us today. And the geneticists over the next few years are going to tell us a lot about what those genes do and what the story is. So out of that comes what I call the great human diaspora. And you know, we often think about the colonial period, the historical colonial period, as being the most consequential colonial event. That was nothing compared to this one. And this one was done by Africans. Because they left Africa, and the end product was a species, a weedy species that gets itself into every environment on the planet and alters it. How does it happen? Sometime between 80 and 60,000 years ago, modern humans leave Africa. They make it all the way to Southeast Asia, at least by 55,000 years ago, and the dates are all a little wonky still, because remember, radiocarbon dating doesn't go beyond 45, so we're using new methods to get these ages. And they get to Southeast Asia, and then these people build shipworthy vessels. They can't see Australia, but they put them in the water and they sail to Australia. They race across the Australian continent, and they're in Tasmania by 45,000 years ago. And what happens? There's a massive megafaunal extinction. And Denisovans go extinct at the same time. And it looks like now, with the redating, that the hobbit, Floriantis, also goes extinct when modern humans get into that habitat. And then they rapidly move up into Europe. And guess what? Another human species goes extinct. We now know from a paper that just came out in Nature maybe 6-9 months ago that they make it into the circumpolar environments 44,000 years ago. We thought that, just recently we thought they never made it there until 25. So basically, modern humans come out of Africa, they make it into the Arctic just like that. They then get bottled up in this ancient Beringian region for thousands of years, and then they finally figure out how to break that wall, and they make it into North America 14,000 years ago. And there's another massive megafauna extinction that takes place. Okay, so come back to this slide, and I'm going to ask you to use your imagination for a minute. Imagine you're an alien species, a spacefaring species, like in Star Trek, right? And they fly around and they check out and study other planets and the species that are arising on those planets. And they come around 200,000 years ago and they look at Earth, and what do they see? They see some interesting species, 5, 6, maybe there's 10 we might find. But they're all in the Stone Age, they don't cooperate much, they're not building anything interesting, so they go away and they figure, oh, I'll come back in another 50,000, 100,000 years. Let's say they come back 100,000 years ago, they pretty much see the same thing, but this one in Africa, they notice, has started to do some interesting things, things that are a little bit different than the others, thinking complexly and making symbols and so on. And then they come back about 40,000 years ago, and what do they see? Oh, they still see all these species are still present. But they come back for one final visit. Uh-oh. One species left. And that species has infected every environment on the planet. It's destroyed its biosphere, and now it's coming out into space. Well, I tell you what I would do if I was that species. I would turn my particle beam weapons up to 11, and I'd fry it. It's frightening. So the question is, how did we get to be this way? That's what I'm going to address in tonight's talk. How did we become this super successful species? And at the same time, along with that success, a lonely species. Because imagine what it would be like if we had these other species still with us today. So I'm going to build a hypothesis, and I haven't yet come up with a cool name for it. So I just put together the components of it, the cooperation projectile weapon hypothesis. Those are the two key elements of it. We used to think that modern humans spread around the planet because we were smart, right? That's the cognition hypothesis. And cognition is important. I'm not going to poo-pah the importance of cognition. But you don't win battles just by being smarter than your opponent. The way you win battles is by being more cooperative among yourselves and having better weapons. And I think the key aspects of the spread of our species were the evolution of a new, novel form of cooperation that had never been seen by evolution before, wedded to a new technological advance that we still rely on to make work. Now, I wrote about this hypothesis for the general public in a Scientific American article that was published and featured on the front cover just last year. But it's based on a series of publications, academic publications that I've done in Journal of Human Evolution, Annual Review of Anthropology, and most recently the Philosophical Transactions B. So if you want to see the scientific background to it, those are the papers. So I'm going to step back for a second and talk about diet, because I think diet is a key part of the cooperation solution. We don't agree on much of anything in paleoanthropology, and those of you who are in this audience, you know that. But we do have three widely recognized dietary revolutions. And the first one is the systematic hunting and meat consumption. And I'm going to put that at about 1.8 million years ago. People will disagree with the date, but everybody agrees that this is a major step in human origins. The second is what's called the broad spectrum revolution. That was a paper that Ken Flannery wrote in 1968, beautiful paper. And it basically refers to the fact that around 20 to 12,000 years ago, we see this pattern worldwide in many hunter-gatherer societies where the diet gets very, very broad. And that kind of sets up the third revolution, which is the origins of agriculture, right? And that has huge downstream impacts. I'm going to argue that there's a fourth. And the fourth revolution is going to fit between these two, and it's a shift to the use of dense and predictable resources. And I think that occurs somewhere around 200 to 160,000 years ago at the origin point of our lineage, and that there were things that happened in the cognition of our lineage at that time that allowed them to begin to exploit dense and predictable resources. And when they do that, it triggers downstream impacts on evolution, which I'm going to outline for you. So why are dense and predictable resources important? And I'm going to summarize a paper I wrote on this. First off, when hunter-gatherers, and of course we're talking about hunter-gatherer economies here, begin exploiting dense and predictable resources, they reduce mobility, so they stop moving around the landscape so much, and they become more sedentary. So they often don't move their camps even once during a year if they're focused on dense and predictable resources. It often stimulates the evolution of complex technologies that we don't normally see with hunters and gatherers. And third, it often has several impacts on diet, which allows populations to rise. So the health status of the population goes up. But it has some bad things that it does. Often when we see a switch to dense and predictable resources, it triggers territorial behaviors. So what I mean by territorial behaviors are warlike behaviors to protect your boundary that protects those resources. That creates intergroup conflict. And what I'm going to argue is that provides selection mechanisms for extreme levels of cooperation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper by Sam Bowles where he lays out the theory. And also what we call collective intentionality, which is a psychological state that I'm going to explain in a minute. And together, I'm just going to call those things hyper-prosociality. So prosociality meaning cooperation, hyper meaning an extreme level of cooperation. Okay, so hyper-prosocial species, and there's only one, that's us, have a couple of features. They have extreme cooperation with non-kin. And here's a good example. All these people lining up, being cooperative, coming into a room, and there's very little relationship between you, biological. That allows group formation and extended social networks and the formation of a unique feature of modern humans, the formation of these ethno-linguistic groups. Hyper-prosociality also allows and facilitates cooperative breeding. And by cooperative breeding, I mean high levels of alloparenting. And this is when individuals who are not the parents of children commit and help those children grow up through feeding them, protecting them, etc. Humans do this at extraordinary levels, and we have evolved emotions to help that. And if you doubt it, just be in a room when a cute little baby's brought in. And second, crucial, formal mate exchange. What we call in anthropology reciprocal exogamy. So exogamy is out-group marriage, and reciprocal means that there's a contract that underlies it. And reciprocal exogamy is one of the key foundations of human social structure. Okay? And up until recently, basically every society in the world had formal mate exchange. And then finally, the proclivity to follow rules and enforce third-party punishment, which keeps all of this working. That's all unique to modern humans. Okay, but the problem is hyper-prosociality has both positive and negative implications. Now you might think of this as a negative implication, but modern humans cooperate to do the most extraordinary things like lining into a plane, sitting in seats that are way too small, and being fed crap food for 17 hours, right, while you're flying to Australia. But being willing to do this allows us to do extraordinary things, right? Build civilizations. But the obvious negative implication is we rely on it to make war. I'm going to talk more about that as we move forward. This is extraordinary cooperation where we take normally men, but increasingly women as well. We put them together, they're unrelated, and we ask them to fight side by side. And in that context, they build strong emotions of brotherhood and sisterhood. And I'd argue that those emotions have a genetic proclivity to them. They're evolved emotions. Okay. Now, what Tomasello means by collective intentionality is the group-mindedness, the feeling of usness that humans cherish, they love it, and we seek it out all the time. And the skills and motivations and emotional intelligence to operate within a society as a whole. We value those people. We call it emotional intelligence. This is unique to modern humans, and it has these same good and bad consequences. Now, almost exactly a year ago, I was in London and I was giving a talk at the Royal Academy, and it was a conference in honor of Richard Leakey. And when it was over, I went to the British Museum, and they had this beautiful exhibit on the rise of Celtic nationalism. And so I'm going to use Celtic nationalism as an example. Modern humans have strong feelings, strong emotional proclivities to love to be with people who speak the way you do, who look the way you do, who dress the way you do, to the point where you can be with these people listening to music that you love together, dressing and dancing and so on, and you may not even know them, yet you feel like you love them. This is an evolved emotion. It has a function, just like bipedality. And therefore, in paleoanthropology, we need to be seeking to explain it, just like anatomy. So those feelings allow us to accomplish things as societies at extraordinary levels that we couldn't otherwise accomplish if we didn't have them. But then in the same exhibit, it has these incredible examples of the Celtic love for warfare. And here's an example, Celtic warriors, and they have these huge trumpets that rise up above the infantry and the cavalry. And they had one there that you could blow, and it makes this huge droning sound. So imagine hundreds of these things being blown. And in warfare, you have this situation where you have men, often men, but like I said, increasingly women, who are unrelated to each other, yet will stand boot to boot, shoulder to shoulder, with an intense feeling of brotherhood for the person next to them, feeling like their strength and their weapons and their ferocity is way more than the people across that field. Yet the problem is, the people across that field have that same emotion, right? And we all know what happens to those guys. They won a couple of battles and then they're all slaughtered. So where does that come from? Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, none of this applies to me. But if you've read this book, you know it's not true. This book makes a very strong case that most of our political views have nothing to do with rational thought, but rather our feelings of usness and groupness that we get from belonging to those groups. It's a fascinating book. So what I'd argue is that this suite of emotions and feelings and proclivities is an evolved proclivity. And I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. It's shared by all modern humans, it's embedded in the genome, and thus it's subject to evolutionary explanation, just like any other anatomical feature or whatever that we might be talking about. Now, my hypothesis is that feature is not expressed in precisely the same manner with other closely related hominin species, that it's unique to our lineage. Okay. Here's the problem. It's very hard to explain with standard neo-Darwinian theory. Okay? So it's theoretically challenging. Neo-Darwinian theory explains animal cooperation with two general theories. Kin selection theory. Very powerful. However, it does not explain it with humans because it requires a degree of relatedness between the cooperators. And we cooperate with 0 levels of genetic relatedness. The second hypothesis was developed by Trivers, reciprocal altruism. It also fails because we don't see our level of cooperation evolved in other animals, so it would only work for one. But also, reciprocal altruism requires a reasonable expectation of payoff that is not met with extremely large sets of modern human cooperators. So there's no way that you can argue that large armies of individuals are cooperating due to Trivers' reciprocal altruism because there can't be any assumption of payoff between them. So it just doesn't work. Now, Sam Bowles published a paper in Science, and then he wrote this wonderful book with Herbert Gintis, Cooperative Species, where they build a model, a mathematical model, also built on computer simulation, on how you get high levels of cooperation to evolve. And what it does is it rests on between-group cooperation. You first have to set up a situation where you have between-group cooperation. That leads to intergroup conflict, and then what you find is that groups with highly cooperative individuals expand at the expense of those groups that don't have cooperative individuals. And that leads to the spread of hyper-prosocial groups that then have the genes for proclivities to cooperate at high levels. Now, this is a theory based only on math and computer simulation. Sam is an economist. But there's one crucial requirement. To get his model to work, the individuals have to be cultural and thus capable of developing rules and norms for conduct. That's why his model doesn't work with non-human animals. You have to have language and culture to get his model to work. Okay, but here's the problem, and I've actually had this conversation with Sam. How do we stimulate conflict? Ethnographically known hunter-gatherers do not have high levels of warfare, and this is most beautifully shown by the title of this book on the Khoisan people, the Bushmen, the harmless people. And the point that Elizabeth Marshall Thomas was making is that there's just very, very low levels of warfare. So how do we take the African situation, where we would expect very low levels of warfare, and turn it into a highly aggressive, warlike species, and create the context for the evolution of cooperative behaviors? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. There's a very powerful theory in behavioral ecology that was developed by Jerome Brown. And Jerome studied birds. And he published this paper in a tiny, tiny journal. And it was one of the most important papers in biology. And what he argued was that when animals are in high levels of competition and the resources are economically defendable, when you have those contexts, that will trigger conflict, territorial behaviors. And his theory has now become one of the most powerful theories for explaining why animals fight in biology. Okay? So how does it work? Individuals will act aggressively to attain certain goals that maximize their survival and reproduction. So that's the Darwinian basis to the theory. Natural selection will then favor fighting when it facilitates these goals. One major goal of all organisms is to secure a food supply. So if food can be defended, then it follows that aggressive behavior in its defense should be selected for. And these principles have been shown to operate again and again, hundreds of times across different species in behavioral ecology. And there are now very formal models for how it operates. So if the food cannot be defended or is too costly to control, then aggressive behaviors are counterproductive. Okay? Bottom line, if the food is easy to defend, you will develop strategies to defend it aggressively. Now we can project it in a simple model like this. Okay? So on this axis, I have resource predictability. Very predictable over here. So in other words, by predictable we mean it's predictable temporally in time and in space. And down here is low predictability. And here's density. Low density, high density. The resource has to be highly ranked or crucial. Okay, so it has to be important to you. Bottom line being, if a resource is highly predictable and dense, the model predicts that you will fight to defend it. It's basic economics. We do the same thing. Resources that are important, that are predictable and dense, we go to war over those resources. Agricultural land, fought over throughout antiquity. What do we fight over today? Oil. What are we going to be fighting over in the future? Water. Very simple to explain. Okay, so what I've argued is when humans make the transition to dense and predictable resources, it leads to conflict and complexity. And these are the papers where I've published that argument, and of course, Scientific American paper. So if we go back to Sam Bowles' theory, right, here it's laid out, all I've added to it is how do we get between group competition? We get it through territoriality, being stimulated by the dietary shift to dense and predictable resources. Okay. Now we know that the modern human lineage evolved in Africa. I've just summarized for you the evidence for that. And then that leads to two questions. Next questions I'm going to address. One, what resources in Africa are predictable and dense? Right, we need to find them, because those are the ones that are going to trigger the conditions for the selection for cooperation. And then we need to ask the paleoanthropological question. When and where in human evolution did people begin to exploit them? Okay, so that entire argument is reviewed in this paper that I just published this year, and I'm going to very quickly review that long paper for you. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the details, but I'm just going to tell you what I say in that paper. Are migratory species dense and predictable? And whenever, just look around this room, right? Many of these animals are migratory, and you know that they're abundant in Africa. Would people defend them as food resources? The problem is the costs of territorial patrol are too high. Okay, they're too widely spread, so no. But if you're an equestrian hunter-gatherer, you will, just like Great Plains Indians did when they switched to horses. And one exception would be topographic bottlenecks. So where the animals are squeezed through places, we know hunter-gatherers defended those. But basically, no, this is not a food resource you'll defend. It's not one that would trigger territoriality. What about little residential buckies, right? Little things like dik-diks and dikers and so on. No. And there's a couple of reasons. They're not dense enough. They're depleted very, very quickly. And they can go extinct in a region through overhunting extremely rapidly. So, no. And we don't find hunter-gatherers defending their territories. What about underground storage organ plants, tubers, things that, like, for example, the Hadza and the Bushmen use? No, these are not resources that are defended because they're too low ranked. So in other words, they're not highly valued resources, and they're easily depleted. So once you use them, they're gone for quite some time. So no, that's not a food resource that you're going to defend. And of course, this is why modern hunter-gatherers that live in terrestrial environments in Africa don't have high levels of warfare. These resources don't trigger it. What about trees with nuts? We know that California Indians defended nut-bearing groves, as did Great Basin Indians. The only trees that we know of in Africa that are really productive like that are mongongo nut trees, but they're too rare, they're not real common. There's only one area in Botswana that has them. And they're not defended ethnographically. So my feeling is no, but that's probably one resource that we could look at as being potentially defendable. So if we take terrestrial African environments, they're down here on this graph. They wouldn't stimulate strongly territorial behaviors. And this is, of course, why African hunter-gatherers appear peaceful to us. The record we have is mostly terrestrial-based diets. But what about non-terrestrial resources? Rivers, lakes, and marine fish. Absolutely. These are resources that, again and again, when you look at the ethnographic record, hunter-gatherers defended them highly aggressively. But they have one problem. You normally need sophisticated technologies to exploit them. Ones that require a long period of time of ratcheting up their complexity. So in my opinion, these come late in human evolution. Very, very late. Now we have examples of some of those, and I'm going to talk about in a minute. But what about the other non-terrestrial resources, like marine intertidal shellfish, which you have in abundance here in coastal California? It requires no technology to collect that food resource. All you need is a cognitive command of the lunar-driven tidal rhythms, and you can exploit them at high levels of productivity. And they're very, very dense, and they're super predictable. And we know from ethnographic records that the most warlike hunter-gatherers anywhere in the world are coastal hunter-gatherers. So what I've argued is when we add marine resources and aquatic resources to the diet, it triggers territoriality, and that sets up the selective conditions for the origins of cooperative behavior. And at that point, I'm relying on Sam Bowles' argument. Like I said, we know that coastal hunter-gatherers are extremely warlike. And this is just one example from coastal California. And what you see here is the frequency of projectile injuries by age and group, and this is males. And look at that, between 15 and 25, nearly 20% of individuals have projectile injuries, 18%. And most of them are concentrated about the head and the neck. So 18% of the individuals in society are dying through violence in these coastal hunter-gatherers. And this is a pattern we see all over the world. There's an example in Africa, the Jebel Sahaba cemetery in Nubia. These were hunter-gatherers that lived about 13,000 years ago, but they were a riverine-based economy. There were 59 individuals. 40% of these people died by violence. These are extraordinarily high levels of violence for any society. And it's because they're focusing on dense and predictable resources. Outsiders are trying to take them, they're defending them. So when and where in human evolution do people begin to exploit dense and predictable resources? Now, my field work has been based at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, and this is a question, a long-term question I've been interested in. Generally speaking, what is the impact of coastal adaptations on human origins? And I've written quite a bit about that. Now, at Pinnacle Point, we've developed a record which is shown in red here compared to the other major sites in South Africa that you may have known, Colossus River, Bloembos, Deep Kloof, and so on. One of the things that we've been able to accomplish over the last 16 years of field work is we've developed the longest record, easily, in South Africa. And importantly, PP13B, which is the site that really made Pinnacle Point famous, we have a site that dates to the origin point of our lineage, and those are super, super rare in Africa. Just a couple of slides of what Pinnacle Point looks like. If you're ever in South Africa, send me an email and maybe we can arrange a visit. It's a spectacular location. And in 2007, we published our first major result in Nature. And what we reported on was the presence of coastal resources in the diet of the people at about 162,000 years ago. And the reason that paper was important is because that was the oldest date that we had for people expanding their diet to the coastline. And it still stands as the oldest date. And this is kind of an interesting finding. That's a whale barnacle. And whale barnacles only live on the skins of whales. It's not evidence that people were using boats to hunt whales. We know they weren't. But what it is, it's a proxy that people were scanning the coastline for wash-ups and then scavenging the blubber in the skin and bringing that back into the cave. And what's left from that behavior are, of course, the barnacles. All of these are intertidal shellfish, and obviously that's a scavenged food resource. Now, I'm just going to tell you what this slide means because it summarizes an enormous amount of data, and it's published in some of those papers. But if you're familiar with the coast, and many of you may be since you live here in California, you know that there's a part of the intertidal zone that's only available during the very low spring tide, right, when the moon and sun are in alignment, and you're at your maximum low tide. And you can get way down there to collect shellfish. And then you have a middle zone, and I have that kind of in yellow, caution. You can sometimes get down there during a normal low tide. And then you have this green area at the top, which is easy to get to, right, during most low tides. And here's time on this axis. And what we see is at first, people begin to use the easy part. These are the sites that document that. That's back at 160,000 years ago. And then right around 110, they start getting into the lowermost areas where you can only go under really low spring tide conditions. And this is a clear indicator that we have what I call a formal coastal adaptation, where people are wedded to the sea in an economic manner. And we see other things that indicate this. We see shell middens, where the majority of the matrix is shell. And we also see them collecting seashells as a symbolic act. So I've argued that we have strong evidence that at 110,000 years ago, we have people formally embedded in the coastline and therefore using this dense and predictable resource. But I think it goes back to here. But we haven't found evidence for that yet. But we're searching. We have one site in Eastern Africa that dates to about 90,000 years ago that has clear harpoon technology in association with big riverine fish. But it's just one observation, and we need that validated by more field work. So in South Africa, we have people in dense and predictable resources back to about 160. In North Africa, they get there about 110, and then there's a big break in the record, and we see it again around 25,000 years ago. In the Sahara and the Nile, it's very late. In Central Africa, it's also quite late. In East Africa, it's very late. And then we have that one observation here, which I think requires more formal analysis. But we have very strong evidence of 25,000 years ago, but what I would argue, there's only right now one place in Africa where we see people commit to dense and predictable resources, and that's the coast of South Africa. So what I would argue is the key shift to this dense and predictable resources that triggers territoriality, that sets up the evolution of cooperative behaviors first occurs in the South African coast 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. And when that happens, it produces a new hyper-cooperative species of which the world has never seen before. But I'm going to close my talk with asking the question, what is the preferred weapon of that cooperative species? Now, in 2012, we published a result in Nature that they featured on the front cover on the earliest evidence for what we call microliths. And they date to about 71,000 years ago. And they don't look very impressive, right? These are stone tools, and you can see they're a couple of centimeters long at most. But these are an extraordinary technological breakthrough. They radiate worldwide around 20,000 years ago. And how do you make them? You set up a special core, piece of stone, that you can knock off these long, thin blades. And then you take those little blades and you stack them and you blunt one side. So one side is sharp and one side is blunt. And they're too small to hold in your hand to use as a tool. So what do you do with them? You mount them. So you take, and these are archaeological examples and these are experimental examples. You take a piece of bone, these are bone, you slot it, and then you glue the microliths into it as barbs. And anyone knows, if you take a projectile that looks like that and you throw it into an animal, it creates a puncture wound. That animal runs for 3 days. And you'll never find it because the wound will close up. But you arm it with these blades on the side, and as they go in, they explode, they cut the animal up, they bring it down much quicker, but importantly, they have it bleed out very quickly and you can track it. These are darts for atlatls, spear throwers. And it's a breakthrough technology. Here's a picture of Australian Aborigines with atlatls taken in 1914. Australian Aborigines never had bows and arrows, but they could hit a bug at 30 meters with one of these. And what an atlatl gives you over a hand-cast spear, way more distance, way more power, and way more accuracy. And we know from the archaeological record that Neanderthals and all the hominids outside of Africa only had hand-cast spears. They had no high-performance projectile technology. So when modern humans developed projectile technology, and I think it happened around 70,000 years ago, this created a species, a new hyper-cooperative species, wedded to this new proclivity to cooperate that could field large teams of warriors from ethno-linguistic groups instead of 2 or 3 warriors from a band. Now that you can draw on an entire ethno-linguistic group, you can put 80 warriors in the field as opposed to 2 or 3. They have evolved emotions that create a bond of intense feelings of brotherhood. But they're not related to each other genetically. They fight together on land and sea under any conditions. And they attack their opponents and their prey by flinging these ingenious projectiles of all types: boomerangs, bows and arrows, atlatl darts, etc. And that creates a new super predator that can swarm their prey, and it leaves no animal or competitor safe, whether it's the largest animal on the planet, like a whale, or it's our competitors, like Neanderthals, that they met face to face as they came out of Africa, but also the vast megafauna that they encountered in the new lands that they conquered, such as Australia and the Americas. So what I'm going to do to close off my talk, instead of a conclusion slide, is walk you through what I think are the final steps in the addition of the key features that make humans unique. Sometime between 250 and 200,000 years ago, we evolved a complex cognition, and that was at the origin point of the modern human lineage. That complex cognition was a pre-adaptation. It set up the conditions for people to learn how to exploit dense and predictable resources. Now, I talked about that in the first paper that I published in Scientific American in 2010. That switch to dense and predictable resources triggers elevated territoriality and conflict. And I think that happened sometime between 200 and 100,000 years ago. And we now have designed a series of field projects to go out and nail that date. That creates the selection regime for hyper-prosociality and the emotional structure for it that we call collective, psychologists call collective intentionality. That leads to the formation of what we call multi-scale society, something totally unique to humans, where we have bands of people linked together into ethno-linguistic groups, instead of a social structure like chimps, where every band or group is at war with every other group. And I think that happens around 100,000 years ago. And we've just designed a project to begin to look at that. When we add advanced projectile weapons, that triggers the great human diaspora and the annihilation and extinction of our cousins, Neanderthals and Denisovans and other species that we haven't yet named. And I just talked about that in this Scientific American paper. So I want to thank my fantastic South African team and all the students who have worked on our project over the years, and the Mossel Bay community, and of course our funding organizations. So thank you.